Remember, everyone, Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig was the greatest wrestler to ever live because nobody beats Mr. Perfect. Nobody. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Curt Hennig Was the Best, Changed My Mind. I am your host, Steph. Today on our Perfect Podcast, I'd like to wish Curt a happy birthday. He would have been 64 today. I often find myself wondering what Curt did on his birthdays. Probably wrestling. I actually have a special treat for you, my dear listeners. I was able to get an email to the great Jim Cornette, which him and Brian Last read on the drive-thru this past week. We're going to listen to that and then comment on it. I would like to personally thank Brian Last and the great Jim Cornette for being great and reading and answering my email. I'd also like to say that I'm also recovering from a cold, so please bear with me as my voice will cut in and out. Before we start, I'd like to add, if you would like to get to be a guest on our show, or you would like to have a friendly debate, please contact me at mrperfectisperfect0328@gmail.com. That's mrperfectisperfect0328@gmail.com. You can find this podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Stay tuned for a Patreon page that I'd like to create, so if you like what you hear, you can support the show. Okay, let's listen to this, and then we'll come back and make comments about it.
Let's get our next question here. This one was sent to cornydrivethru@gmail.com from Steph in Pennsylvania. With Curt Hennig's birthday coming up on Monday, March 28th.
Oh my gosh.
I was wondering if instead of talking about stupid wrestling today, why not have an episode dedicated to the greatest wrestler to ever live, Curt Hennig? I would love to hear your take, Jim, on all of the great stories you have of Curt Hennig. Curt is my favorite wrestler of all time, and in my opinion, the greatest wrestler to ever live. If there was one thing you could tell Curt today, what would it be? I have a podcast called Curt Hennig is the Best.
Oh boy.
Change my mind. I'd love to interview you. Well, that's probably not going to happen, but here's your chance, Steph.
I'm not going to try to change. I think his mind is pretty well made up. I'm not going to try to change his mind. I can't honestly say that Curt Hennig, in my opinion, is the greatest single wrestler that ever lived of all time. That takes into a lot of territory into account. But he was one of the all-time best. And that's the thing about it. Curt was not only he was a second-generation wrestler. He'd grown up around the business. Larry Hennig, of course, was legendary, and the team of Hennig and Harley Race in the late 60s was the premier in-ring team. They are mentioned as the same breath with Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens, or the Midnight Express, or on down the line, right? So Curt got the business, and he also had, he became, like a lot of the second generation guys, he became a better athlete and a better worker than his father. Jeff Jarrett did the same thing. Jeff was a better athlete and a better worker than Jerry was. Curt was a better athlete and better worker than Larry Hennig was. But they came along, 20 years later when the business had changed, and as a result, Curt obviously was used at a high level in most of his WWF run and was the AWA World Champion and etc. But Larry Hennig was a bigger money-drawing star in his time just because the places he worked, there was more money to be drawn in the 60s and 70s. But, Curt, the match with Bret Hart, what was that, SummerSlam 92 or
91.
91.
MSG.
See, I knew you'd know it. Bobby Eaton called me over to his house one day. We had just left WCW. Bobby was still there. And I went over and he said, hey, Corny, have you seen this match? And it was Bret Hart and Curt Hennig. And we sat and went, Bobby loved it. He said, wow, those guys are so good. And Curt, he was a natural. You see, Dolph Ziggler has adapted a lot of the animated bumping and the extra little things that Curt put in, but nobody's ever done it quite like Curt. That's why Vince came up with the Mr. Perfect thing, because he was, obviously the filmed vignettes were works. He wasn't, hitting a home run and then catching it at the same time from the other end or all those things, but he could do all that shit. He could do he could bowl and play football and basketball and blah, blah, blah and wrestle like crazy. And he was a fun guy to be around. I've told you the story that when Hennig pantsed Stan Lane on the fucking plane, Stan had both of his hands trying to shove his bag in the overhead compartment, standing over the top of this guy in a suit and tie and everything, and Hennig across the aisle in the seat behind Stan just grabbed his Zubaz and down to his ankles. He had no fucking underwear on, so his wee-wee's hanging in that guy's face who's selling it like crazy. Hennig was a master ribber. Hennig was the guy. Was it Hennig not the one that ribbed up the Rougeaus and the Bulldogs
Yep.
to where yeah.
It all started because of him, yeah.
He was
And he had just got there. He was new to the company, too.
Well, he didn't care, though. See, that's the thing. Curt Hennig didn't give a shit. If he was going to play a rib and thought it was going to be funny, he didn't give a shit. He's in the wrestling business. He's one of the boys. They fired me. Oh, shit. I'll go back to Minnesota. Whatever the case. So he was a master ribber. He was a guy most of the guys wanted to hang out with. He knew the business. He was a master worker. I wish I'd got to spend more time around him. I didn't really. Just the couple of years that we passed in the mid-90s in the WWF was really the only time I got to spend around him. But yeah, just, a master craftsman. And he was another guy that got the Lloyds of London deal, right?
He did, actually. The Bret Hart match, which one day we should do a watch-along. We're not going to do it today because we have a different match, but we should do one for that match. That was fantastic, and it elevated Bret, gave him the Intercontinental belt. It was also the last match Curt had until November of 92, when he returned to the Survivor Series after the Ultimate Warrior was fired.
Yeah.
So that was when he got it.
And there was something, I'm trying to remember now, wasn't there something, was it him or was it Rude? That there was something going on with the Lloyds of London policy and the office said the wrong thing and fucking he got pulled.
I'm not sure.
What am I thinking about?
It may have been, because there were different weird things with Curt Hennig where he would show up and disappear, he would work, he wouldn't work. And even then you would hear rumors about the insurance policy, which is kind of crazy because I was just a fan as a kid. But it was all those Minnesota guys. Road Warrior Animal, didn't he get the same policy?
Well, and see, here's the goddamn deal. Once again, I didn't see these policies, so I don't know exactly the verbiage and how they were written, but I was in the office in Stamford at the time that Animal and Hawk came back for that run, and they brought draws in, etc. But Animal's deal with Lloyds of London, he had collected also on a back injury that he could never wrestle again, and he collected the money on his policy, and then somehow the deal was, because we had to be told this because the creative team and the agents, producers, Animal couldn't wrestle a single match. As long as he and Hawk wrestled tag, or he and anybody wrestled tag matches, Lloyds of London could not get the money back from him for his career-ending back injury that they paid on, but if he was to wrestle a single match, then he'd be liable to have to give it back or give something back. There'd be some issue. So we could put Hawk in individual singles matches, but we couldn't put Animal in one. I mean, just to change, not like we wanted to break them up and make them singles anyway, but just TV matches to make things different. No, you cannot book Animal in a single match because it was Lloyds of London. And Animal had it. Hennig had it. Rick Rude had it. Who else? Flair got one and never cashed in on it. I think he was the only one that never got one. But that was a big thing for a while there, and then gradually, wouldn't you know, who quit offering insurance policies to pro wrestlers? That would be Lloyd's of London.
I Googled what you said before, and I'm actually looking for it. Apparently you were right. WWE accidentally stooged him off to Lloyd's of London, and they revealed, oh, here we go. He took over commentary for the WWF for a couple of years, but he was never satisfied with that role. He decided he would attempt another comeback. Sadly, it never happened, as someone in the company leaked this info to Lloyd's of London. This led to Hennig losing his insurance policy from Lloyd's, but more importantly, he lost faith in the WWF, and that's right before he jumped to WCW in '97.
Yep, I remember that. Somebody somehow said something, and he got hot and said, well, fuck y'all. And there you go. Because did I mention that Curt Hennig was one of the old boys, and if he decided to say fuck you, he'd say fuck you and go back to Minnesota. So there you have it.
Okay, everyone. So we're back. Again, I'd like to thank Brian Last, and I'd like to thank Jim Cornette for answering my email. It was so great to hear. I was actually kind of like, oh my gosh, I think they're going to read my email this time. And they did. I also like to say that I'm recovering from a cold, so please bear with me as my voice gets back to normal. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I believe Jim is wrong. I believe Curt Hennig is and was the greatest wrestler to ever live. He was really great. If you watch him, and like I said in my last episode, all the wrestlers basically said in every interview I've ever seen when they talk about Curt was that you got a night off. You know, you weren't going to feel anything when you went home because Curt was a professional and he knew what he was doing. I do agree that, well, as I wasn't around in the 60s and Curt was a kid in the 60s and the 70s, you can't hold a candle to his father because, you know, his father was older and able to wrestle. So, I do believe Jim Cornette is correct on that. I mean, I have seen some of Larry's matches and they are darn good. I mean, all you have to do is look up Larry Hennig, probably matches, Larry Hennig's matches on YouTube, and I found some, and boy, were they good. Some were kind of like, you know, you knew that he was kind of funny in the ring. I think that's where Curt probably got it from, you know, his sense of humor. Probably got it from his father. Yeah, I definitely would say Larry Hennig is good. Or was good. Back in the 60s and 70s. And I'm sure more people came out because really they didn't put, you know, I doubt seriously that wrestling was around on TV. So it was more like you had to go out. You had to go and see the matches. And honestly, I wish I kind of was around then because I honestly would have loved to have seen wrestling live. I didn't get to see wrestling till 2000, maybe 2001. And by then it was kind of blasé anyway. But I do believe that Jim is correct about that Larry drew more money in the 60s and 70s. Again, because TV and wrestling, I don't think had been a thing. If it was like in its infancy. So, you know, talking about that kind of thing where he would draw more money. But I mean, Curt is a great athlete. He was a great athlete. And, all you'd have to do is look at all his matches and, you know, the 91 match with Brett, as I has stated in the first episode, was, once you knew that Curt was hurt, you know, his back was bothering him so bad. It's actually kind of hard to watch that match. When Jim mentions that, oh, was it 92? And Brian goes, no, it was 91. Yeah. And that's a hard match to watch because, you know, if you read Brett's book, that Kurt's back was just so out of whack. He was having back spasms. And for me, when I rewatched that match, I was kind of like, ooh, oh, Kurt, oh my gosh, how could you even stand it? But, you know, Kurt gave his all in that match. And that's the best thing about it, is because he really wanted to give his all for that. You know, he wanted to give the fans all he had. You know, he wanted to give the fans, and Brett too. You know, Brett said, you know, that it was his idea to tear off the singlet and stuff. But I can't imagine, you know, being there and standing there and being a big fan of Kurt's and knowing that his back is just really bothering him, and you're just going, oh boy, you just cringe every time. Like, I literally watched it again and I'm like cringing every like 5 seconds, like, oh boy, how could you not go, hey Brett, like stop, you know, my back hurts really bad. So it was interesting to me to, you know, hear, you know, Jim's comments about it, and, you know, Brian's too. And yes, Brett talks about Kurt ribbing the Rougeaus and the Bulldogs. Jacques apparently made a comment, and Kurt ran right up to Dynamite and said, hey Dynamite, guess what Jacques thinks about you? That's just how Kurt was, you know, and to hear so many people talk about him with such admiration, it's just so great to hear. You know, I think with all this admiration, I think, you know, Kurt's ego would probably go through the roof, and he'd be smiling from ear to ear and be like, yeah, I told you I was Mr. Perfect, you know. The perfect rib. But yes, I did hear about the Rougeaus and the Bulldogs, and Brett talks about that in his book, and he kind of mentions that Kurt literally went up to Dynamite and said, you know, this is what Jacques thinks of you. So, and like, you know, Jim said, he did not give a shit. But I don't think that Kurt would go back to Minnesota, because wrestling had become so much of his life. I just don't, I mean, he probably would go to like the other company if they had fired him. I think he would just said, all right, I'll go to WCW, or I'll go to somewhere else, you know, I'll go back to the territories or something. Even though the territories were kind of dying. I still believe that Kurt would find a way back to wrestling. There's just no doubt about that. So, I mean, that in itself, I think that Kurt, definitely would, I don't know what kind of contract he would have, or, I mean, before he died, he was going to do what I would consider carnival wrestling. I think that's what he was going to try to do. Like I said, I don't know about that big run that he was supposedly going to have in WWE. I'd like to think that that would have happened, because I think that would have given him some solace, and he could have parted with the WWE on his own terms. But again, I go back to Kurt's own words. You know, he parted with the WWE twice on his own terms. So whether, and you can watch the TNA interview that he did, or the promo that he did on TNA about Brock Lesnar, you know, he talks about making $147 million in wrestling, and I was like, holy cow, that's more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime. Even if it's a lie, it's still a lot of money. And you know what? He deserved every penny, because he was the consummate professional. He knew how to do, you know, as Jim Cornette says, he was one of the boys. He knew the business. He grew up in the business. He was one of them. So I see him, like, even if he had, you know, pulled it out in 2003 and stayed the course, I could see him commentating, but then I could also see him, like, GM, you know, whether he was a guest GM or he was GM at one point. I could just see him eating all that up. You know what I mean? So, I definitely agree with the comments that, you know, he was a prankster. And I love the Stan Lane one, where he pants Stan Lane. There is a video, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to find it. I came across it much by accident. Some gentleman had taped the wrestlers around WrestleMania. I believe it was WrestleMania 13. He was in the hotel with the rest of the wrestlers, and there is like, you see Kurt at the beginning of this gentleman's, he must have had it like in a recording, you know, like with the big recording cameras, you know, back in the 90s, we had these big cameras that like took up half your arm. I know that's hard for you kids nowadays to know about, but I can imagine what they had in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s when I was a baby, you know, 86. But yeah, it looks like this guy literally had a huge camera on his shoulder, and you see Kurt at the beginning, he's like, dude, camera, not a good thing. A lot of people had made comments about that, but I mean, think about it. Would you really want someone to stick a camera in your face when you're at a hotel? I mean, cameras were more for, you know, the arenas. I can't see, like, any of the wrestlers being like, hey, yeah, go ahead, stick a camera in my face. But then there's the gentleman did end up taping the softball game, the celebrity softball game, and someone pantsed Kurt. Because you hear in the background, you hear, oh, somebody pants Mr. Perfect. So whoever that was got sweet revenge for Stan Lane because Kurt pants Stan Lane. So, and that is just one of the many, 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 many pranks or ribs that I've heard from the King Ribster himself or about him. So when it comes to comments about the Lloyds of London policies, I have heard them. I'm sure Kurt's heard them too. I don't know how to think about that, because there is an interview that Kurt did, and he was asked, you know, what happened with that? Was it Lloyds of London? Was, you know, what happened with Vince? Was there heat between you and Vince? And Kurt said himself in the interview, no, I left with a handshake. So when it comes to the rumors of that, I tend to believe Kurt, because he said it himself that, you know, he didn't burn that bridge. That bridge was never burnt. He left with a handshake. In his own words, he said that the WWF, he wanted to come back and wrestle, and the WCW offered him a better deal. And as he said, Eric Bischoff and the WCW, they just beat that to death. So when it comes to that kind of controversy, or, I mean, he may have lost his policy. I don't know. It's just a rumor. But I tend to believe Kurt and Kurt's own words, that it was just simply, you know, he got a better deal from Eric Bischoff. And there is an interview they did with Eric Bischoff, and he kind of admits, you know, yeah, Kurt came into my office with his dad. I think it was kind of cool that, you know, Kurt used his dad as like an agent. You know, he didn't really have an agent, but he used his dad. I thought that was so cool. I mean, because, I mean, who would want better for their son? You know, you go into Eric Bischoff's office, you say, hey, are you going to treat my son good? And Eric Bischoff goes, yeah. You know, I mean, I don't know what the exact words were because I wasn't in that meeting. But I'm just saying, you know, when it comes to the Lloyds of London, and did he get mad at Vince, and did he, you know, thumb his nose up at the office? To me, those are just all rumors, because Kurt said himself, and like I said, I tend to believe Kurt. So when it comes to, you know, those kind of comments about that, I'm just like, I'll take Kurt's words over everybody else's, because that's what Kurt said. So if you'd like to look at that video, again, all you'd have to look up is radio interview with Curt Hennig on YouTube, and you should be able to find it. But they ask him all kinds of questions, anywhere from Bret Hart to Tom Zank, and I love how he talks about Jesse Ventura, because I had mentioned to Jesse, and I still have that interview to give to everyone. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. I don't know how long I can do this for, because I have a job of my own where I work 40 hours a week. So, but I will try to get that out, the first interview I did with Jesse. I actually am trying to get a second interview with Jesse, where I ask him a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to name drop this podcast again, because when I name dropped it with Jim Cornette, you'd be surprised how many people contacted me and started, listening and downloading my podcast. So I'm very, very excited. Thank you so much, Jim Cornette and Brian Last, again for that. But I was planning on going on Clubhouse and maybe talking to Jesse Ventura. Let's get a little more in depth with, when he faced Kurt and Kurt's dad. It was, Jesse will say, I fought him and his dad and with Adrian Adonis, who, I know only because, Roddy Piper had talked about him in his Celebrity Ghost Story. So, it was, I like that ghost story because Piper seemed like a good person, Anyway, back to Jim Cornette. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of those guys had insurance policies because, it's a rough life as a wrestler. And I can't imagine being one. I wanted to be one when I was younger, but, there wasn't much room for an average looking girl, in wrestling. I mean, it was more for those good looking girls that, could eat a whole pizza and not gain any weight. Well, I played sports and, I stayed at a certain weight. So, I'm just one of them average girls, look wise and stuff. I don't consider myself a beauty or a diva. But I would have loved to have learned wrestling from Kurt. I think he would have been an excellent teacher. And he would have, shown me the ropes, and I think he would have been not lenient, but he would have pushed me to the brink of, if this is what you want to do, you're going to have to look the part. So I can see myself definitely learning from the best or the greatest. But, yeah. And, I was so excited when I was actually at work listening to the podcast, Jim Cornette's Drive-Thru, and I saw Kurt's name there, and I thought, ooh, I hope that is my email, because at the last minute I thought, well, let me try to send one more email to Brian and to Jim Cornette. Let me just scribble some words on on an email here, and I was trying to type fast, and in between, at work, what I do, I managed to get this email out about, the podcast and about Kurt, and the fact that his birthday is, it's significant to me. I actually find myself writing it on my calendar every year, Kurt Hennig's birthday, only because it's really close to mine. Mine's April 20th. So, mine will be coming up too soon. And, I'm just so grateful for, Brian and for Jim to read my email. It was actually quite extraordinary when you actually get to talk to these people or you get to interact with these people, especially because, I've only been listening to Jim for, about 6 months, 7 months. But I'm a total fan in everything he talks about. And he's talked about Rick Rude. He's talked about Larry the Axe. And he's talked about, of course, Kurt before. I kind of wish they had done the whole episode in dedication to Kurt, because that would have just been so awesome. But, and Brian talks about when he came back in 92. So in 92, The Ultimate Warrior and Davey Boy Smith. And Brett talks about this in his book too. So if you'd like to check that out, it's Bret Hitman Hart, I believe is the name of the book. And he mentions that, yeah, Davey Boy and the Warrior got popped for human growth hormones, and then they kind of needed someone to come in and help Savage, so they asked Kurt to do it. And I'm guessing, of course, Kurt said yes. Brett mentioned something about Kurt having to prove himself to Vince. I'm not sure what that was about. Maybe that was the impression that Kurt gave to Brett. Or maybe Kurt, in passing, had said something to Brett about that. I'm not sure. But I did read that in Brett's book, and I was just like, I don't think the greatest wrestler to ever live would have to prove himself to anybody. But that's just me. So I am just so grateful that, Jim Cornette and them have put me on the map, so to speak, because ever since they mentioned my podcast, I've had over 25 downloads, and I hope we keep growing. I, want everybody to tell your friends, tell everybody that is a wrestling fan and likes the old time wrestling that we all grew up with, as, Mr. Perfect was perfect, and he played it so well. And I know those vigilettes, or viginettes, I know, that he's not going to throw, he was like, oh, he can't hit a home run and catch it on the other end. He threw the football and caught his own pass. Now, I know, everybody knows, you can't do that, sorry. I don't think physics would, allow you to do that, but still, we were allowed to dream. We were allowed to see Kurt kind of rebrand himself and kind of make himself the perfect, perfect passer, the perfect home runner, or, he would hit home runs, or he would bowl a perfect game. And everybody knows, of course, he didn't really, but again, he could bowl, he could do all that stuff. And I agree with Jim wholeheartedly that, at least Jim got to be at least with him somewhat. I never ever got to meet him, which is something I wish I could have. And I do think that, that Kurt and I would be friends. But, that was just, one little glimpse of, the stuff to come. Like I said, I'm trying to right now get, a second interview with Jesse Ventura, kind of get a little more deeper into what Jesse Ventura thought of Kurt Hennig or his father, Larry the Axe, because they were, a tag team, and I know Jesse didn't spend a lot of time with Kurt either. It's more, I'm just trying to, see what I can grudge up, for the podcast, and there's more to come, so just stay tuned. This has been just a wonderful ride, and I just couldn't imagine anything like what's been going on. Like I said, I'm just trying to name drop the podcast and see what sticks, and hopefully you like what you hear. And like I said, there is a possible Patreon page coming, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to look into it and do my research and try to see if that's something worth doing, because if you like what you hear, you can always go ahead to the Patreon page and you can support the work and the show. So that's pretty much everything I have for you this week. I'm really sorry that it's not longer, but I'm just so excited that I could do a second episode, because it has been a little stressful these past couple of weeks. I've been trying to think, I need to get a second episode in, and I also wanted to get that interview with Jesse. And I'm also going to see if I can get a short one, maybe with Tyrell. That's Jesse's son. Maybe he'll get in with the interview with Jesse on Clubhouse, and just get some fond and great memories of Kurt and share it for the world to hear, hopefully. If people like my podcast, they will go ahead and, subscribe. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And like I said, stay tuned for that Patreon page. Like I said, I will be doing some research into that. If you like what you hear, you can always subscribe. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to me on Apple Music, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you can hear a podcast. And I will see you next time. Remember, nobody beats Mr. Perfect. Nobody.